Hello and welcome back to the APUS History Curriculum for Era 6. In this video, we'll be looking at Topic 6.8, Immigration and Migration in the Gilded Age. In this video, we're going to be looking at how cultural and economic factors affected migration patterns over time, paying particular attention to the migration of African Americans from the former Confederacy and to the immigration of various peoples from all over the world. So let's get to it. First, let's take a moment to make clear a couple of key terms that we're looking at with this topic. The topic, immigration and migration. Although those two words sound very similar, there are key differences between them. Immigration is specifically looking at those who are arriving in the U.S. from other countries. Migration is looking at those people who are moving around within the U.S., such as from the East Coast to the West. During the Gilded Age, both types of movements are happening in the U.S., and we're going to take a look at both. In addition, for those arriving from other countries, there were two labels applied to these immigrants as well. Those that arrived in the early years of the 19th century, primarily from Northern and Western Europe, mostly England, Ireland, Germany, were labeled as old immigrants. This is up through about 1880. Most had some experience with representative democracy, and with the exception of the Irish, most were Protestant. Many were literate, and some possessed a fair degree of wealth. Although those groups continued to come, there was much greater ethnic diversity amongst the ones called new immigrants, who were primarily arriving after 1880. They were primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe, including Greek, Italian, Polish, Slovak, Serb, Russian, Croats, and others. Although some would come from as far away as China and Japan, at least until they were banned by the U.S. government. None of these groups were predominantly Protestant. In fact, the vast majority were Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. And due to increased persecution of Jews in Eastern Europe, many Jewish immigrants sought freedom in America too. Very few of these newcomers spoke any English, and large numbers were illiterate in their native tongues. None of these groups hailed from democratic regimes, so the American form of government was as foreign to them as its culture was. New York was one of the most popular destinations for immigrants overall, but others included Baltimore, Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, and San Francisco, which was mostly for those arriving from Asia. At New York, immigrants were inspected and processed, first at Castle Garden and then later Ellis Island. Mostly they were inspected for disease, but as immigration laws did begin to be passed, means of support also became an issue. Since many of these newcomers were poor, the overcrowded working-class urban environment became the reality for most, at least until enough money could be saved for an upward move, which was incredibly difficult to do. The dumbbell tenements with little light and ventilation and crowded conditions that encouraged the spread of diseases like cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis weakened many and led to higher infant mortality and shortened lives. There was also little in the way of services to help new immigrants learn about America and American life, other than the schools. So children often helped the older generation adapt. Despite the horrors of tenement housing and factory work, many agreed that the wages they could earn and even the food they could eat usually surpassed their former realities. It wasn't uncommon for many in the cities, though, especially immigrants, to take on piecework as their occupation and work from home. They were paid for each piece. Often this is related to the garment industry. And for each piece they produced, they made a certain amount of money. So therefore, the more they produced, the more money they made. This also serves to encourage child labor, much as what would have been expected in farming environments anyway. Once new immigrants made it through these processing centers and into these cities, this was their main destination, because cities is where most of the jobs were going to be located, factories or piecework. And once the trend was established, letters from America, from friends and family, beckoned more immigrants to various ethnic enclaves, and most major cities had a little section like Little Italy, or Little Odessa, or Little Saigon, or Little Armenia, or towns like Chinatown, Greektown, or Koreatown. This led to an urban ethnic patchwork with little integration between the groups. But these ethnic enclaves helped immigrants maintain connection to their culture, to their homelands. They established churches and synagogues if none were available. Some opened bakeries, cafes, or grocery stores to sell foods that reminded them of their homeland, which could also serve as a gathering place to share news and help each other adapt to life in America. In addition to the immigrants coming to the United States, there are also those Americans who were uprooting themselves and moving to other areas of the country during this time period. Many farm laborers were being replaced by mechanization and sought opportunities in the cities, as did those who failed at homesteading. But the most significant migration during this time period was the Exoduster movement, which began in 1879. This was a mass migration of African Americans out of the South and into the western states. With the failure of Reconstruction, widespread racial violence and widespread oppression under the Black Codes and Jim Crow laws prompted as many as 40,000 people to leave the rural South and settle in the West, particularly in Kansas, where between 1870 and 1890, approximately some 30,000 Black Americans settled in that location. Oklahoma and Colorado were also destinations for these exodusters. While many attempted to homestead, much of the best farmland had already been claimed, so most who did remained quite poor. The most successful of the exodusters were those who moved to urban centers that were developing in the West and Midwest and worked in various trades or even in domestic service. Still others headed even further west to California, where several thousand Black Americans created urban communities in the Sacramento and San Francisco areas. Others went to the Los Angeles area, where some of the original founders of the city had actually been of African descent. Many simply moved to the developing urban areas of the South, but growing discrimination would prompt an even greater migration to the northern states, especially New York and Chicago, but that isn't going to happen until the 1910s and the 1920s. Well, that about covers what you need to know for Topic 6.8, Immigration and Migration in the Gilded Age. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.